Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Survey and Spatial webinar that's been presented by Genevieve Abry on the comparisons of both the New Zealand and South African cadastral systems. You've all got a Slido link there, so if you have any questions for Genevieve during this presentation, please pop those through and we'll get those answered for you at the end of the presentation. So welcome, Genevieve.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for your time and setting aside an hour of your day to hear what I have to share with you. I really appreciate it. And I hope that you get something valuable out of this. And if there are any points that I talk about, because I'm going to discuss a couple points. Let me just start timing this. I'm going to discuss a couple points. So if there are things that interest you that you'd like me to dive into a bit deeper, just let me know so that maybe in a future presentation that I can share that with you and do a bit more research on those particular items that people are interested in. Yeah, I'm from South Africa. I thought it would be an interesting opportunity for me to introduce myself to the community and share a bit what I've learned in the past year or so here in New Zealand. And yeah, it's been very interesting. There have been a couple of things that have surprised me that are the same or things that are different. I did this presentation in South Africa as well recently in February. I got back to New Zealand just before lockdown, actually. And everyone was very interested, but that perspective there was looking at how the New Zealand system is different to the South African one. And this one will show you a bit more of how the South African one is different to New Zealand. As I assume most of you know the New Zealand cadastral system. I'm going to be speaking for about 40 to 45 minutes, and I'm going to tell you a bit about myself, a very brief South African survey history background, a bit about the survey institutions and how you get licensed in South Africa, the Surveyor-General Structure, some of the terminology that has been quite interesting, and the survey differences that I've picked up and surveying in the field and the regulations and how the title deed system works there. And then I'll just go through a couple of the diagrams and the plans to show you what they look like. And then at the end, I think we'll leave some time for questions there, and Jenny can let me know what questions you guys have. So as I'm going through, if you have a question about something I've said, just pop it into Slido and we can look at that afterwards. Cool, let's get into it. Most of you won't know me. I'm Genevieve Abry. I'm from Cape Town. I'm actually Namibian born, but I lived in Cape Town for 20 years and went to school there, and I studied at the University of Cape Town. There are a couple of the surveyors in New Zealand who I do know and who some of which that I actually studied with. So it's nice to have some friendly faces that I know around. In South Africa, I did 2 years survey articles after I graduated, and then I did my professional exams and I got registered and fully licensed in 2014. I then, instead of going into private practice, ended up working for government for the Surveyor-General's office in the Western Cape, which was a very different scenario to what you would normally do. I think most of us study land surveying so that we can go into private practice and work out of the office, not so that we end up inside an office. However, this did surprise me because it threw me into the property law and survey law side of things, and I've really enjoyed it and learned quite a bit. And in fact, it's ended up with I'm doing exactly the same job I was doing in South Africa for 7 years for the Surveyor-General there, for the Surveyor-General here. And I've been here since April last year. So this presentation just touches on the differences I've picked up in that time and what I've been learning. So this is a very brief South African survey history. If there are any South Africans watching, if I do make a couple of mistakes, I apologize. Let me know so I can correct my presentation. But I think the main things to look at here is the arrival of the first land surveyor in Cape Town would have been in 1655. So that shows that the South African cadastral system is actually very old and a lot older than New Zealand's. In about 150 years later, there was the British occupation of the Cape, taking over from the Dutch. So the original survey system is Cape Dutch, and then it's a bit of British influence comes into it as well. And that British influence, funny enough, I can actually see in the New Zealand cadastral system as well. By 1813, you can sell land without surveying it. 1828, the Office of the Surveyor-General was created, and examination of survey diagrams began. What gets interesting is that only 100 years later was the first Land Survey Act created to formalize things, because several issues were starting to happen with trying to figure out how to deal with mistakes in surveys or how to amend descriptions of land and that sort of thing. So this may be of interest to any land surveyors who are thinking of employing South Africans or have South Africans in their office or getting CVs from South Africans and are a bit confused about their qualifications or what information they're giving you. You'll see abbreviations like the SAGC and SAGI. This just gives you a better idea of what those are, what they do, and what they are in comparison to New Zealand. The South African Geomatics Council is similar to the CSLB here in New Zealand. They handle all of the professional registrations of geomatics professionals in South Africa. So that's another thing you'll note, is that in South Africa there are two universities that you can do a surveying degree at. I think the one is KZN, KwaZulu-Natal, and the other one is the University of Cape Town. The University of Cape Town degree you'll see is listed as a BSc Geomatics, which is a surveying degree. So the SAGC handles all of those registrations and monitors CPD points, and they will also handle the exams to register professionals. It might not just be land surveyors, it could also be mining surveyors or engineering surveyors or GIS professionals. They're all in that same group, the same as what would be in Survey and Spatial New Zealand. And then we have another group called SAGI, which is the Voluntary Institute. They don't deal with any exams or any registration, but they deal with a lot of the community's professional CPD point, organizing events, social networking, and any issues that the profession would like to bring up with everyone. And then there's the Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development. That's the department that I was working for. It's where the Office of the Surveyor-General falls under, and the Deeds Office would fall under there as well. And yeah, this was where I was working. The name has changed quite a bit over the years, the same as what I think Lynn's has as well here in New Zealand. What is interesting is that in South Africa, you cannot just do unit titles or the equivalent of unit titles, which is called sectional titles. You have to write an exam to be allowed to do sectional titles, and that exam is managed by this department. It isn't managed by the South African Geomatics Council. So not every land surveyor in South Africa can do unit title surveys. You have to have a qualification to do it. I'll just briefly show this to you guys. The Surveyor-General Structure in South Africa is very similar possibly to what New Zealand used to have. Sorry for the abbreviations, it's just quite a large structure. But you'll have your Minister of the department with his deputies, and then the Chief Surveyor-General is in charge of all the Surveyor-Generals for each province. You'll see here there are 8 Surveyor-Generals. South Africa actually has 9 provinces, but one of them does not have a Surveyor-General. I think it's the Free State. And this has actually happened more recently over several years, that they've tried to have a Surveyor-General in each province. They are starting to think about going back to fewer Surveyor-Generals, because you end up with a different system in each province, which often doesn't work too well when you're trying to work between the two systems. Each Surveyor-General will have a deputy, and he'll have chief surveyors who work for him, and then he'll have a bunch of production surveyors who work for him as well, and are advisors to the Surveyor-General, and examine survey plans that come in. In South Africa, you still have professional licensed cadastral surveyors examining diagrams and signing them. We haven't advanced quite as far as New Zealand in that regard yet. And yeah, so this was the thing that really interested me the most when I moved here in terms of the survey terminology. I thought that when I moved here, I would just be able to learn the new act and the new rules and just be able to go ahead. But it turns out a lot of the terminology is very different. And I think for any South African coming here and any New Zealander employing a South African or working with a South African surveyor, you might find that this will be the first barrier, is the terminology. And it's really helpful to break this down, understand what all of these are, and then go from there. These are just some of them that are the more common terms used. Excuse me. A very interesting one that took a while for me to understand was depositing plans in South Africa. That's not a term that's used. You talk about registering a title deed, but that's also because it's a completely different title registration system. So if you hear your South African colleagues talking about urban or state land or the boundary beacons, just pop over to this table for a bit of a translation. Cool. So over here, I've got a couple of the survey differences that I've picked up while I was busy learning the New Zealand system and comparing it to the South African one. So while physically surveying is exactly the same thing, surveying is physics and geometry, it's exactly the same in both countries. However, there are other smaller things that start changing it up a bit. So there is no version of Landonline in South Africa. There is no automatically generated plans or anything like that. There are still hard copy survey diagrams that are signed by professional land surveyors and examined. What is very interesting is those diagrams are submitted as digital copies, created by land surveyors as digital versions, signed as digital versions, and then printed and signed hard copy, and hard copy is actually kept in the office. So I think that may start changing soon. You'll see my second point here, it has become a bit of a joke here in the office with my colleagues, is that it took me a while to pick up that the New Zealand's bearing system is upside down compared to South Africa's, because it's exactly 180 degrees different. So you don't notice it at first on plans, and you might find that your South African colleague may be giving you bearings in the opposite direction, and if you don't know why, this is why. And it took me a bit of time to pick up that this was the difference. But now it seems like normal, and the orientation looks weird to me. The other thing is, a lot of people think that South Africa has a coordinate-based system, and it uses coordinates, but it's not actually coordinate-based, as in the coordinate doesn't hold all the weight. The mark in the ground holds the weight. So in terms of how you survey and how you do your definition, it's the mark in the ground that is the boundary. So, and then we coordinate those points, and those coordinates appear on the diagrams. I think that's just because we don't, or South Africa doesn't have a lot of ground movement, so it makes that possible to do it that way. But it does confuse a lot of people, because they think that the South African system is actually coordinate based, but it's not. It is based on the marks in the ground. Yeah, there are a couple of other things here. South Africa uses a deed system, not a torrent system. Many South Africans won't know what a torrent system is at all. And then there were a couple of other things I've picked up along the way. Things like in South Africa, if I'm on a primary parcel that I'm busy surveying, if I come across one of my boundary marks that's disturbed, I need to replace it. I can't just mark it as disturbed on my plan. And there are no survey audits in South Africa. While the Surveyor-General does have the ability to check a survey if he needs to, they don't do any survey audits. And figure descriptions and area names. In South Africa on a plan, I'll show you a couple examples of what the plans look like, but in South Africa, you'll do a figure description as the figure A, B, C, D, E, not just putting lot 1 inside the figure. You also cannot adopt boundaries or boundary points on a new primary parcel. So even if you verified that land surveyor survey, you can't just adopt his work. You do need to go and resurvey those points. There are a couple other things here. I don't want to waste too much time going through all of them. But yeah, things like, this is sort of what I was getting at as well, where all boundary points on a parcel or easement under survey have to be physically surveyed. They can't remain unmarked. This was an interesting one for me. In South Africa, easements can cross as many parcels as they would like to, and different titles, as long as they are described that way in their on their easement diagram. And if you would like to do an amalgamation, there has to be a diagram for it. You can't just amalgamate titles like that. You can hold a couple properties or titles in common ownership and tie those together. But if you actually want to re-subdivide and re-lay out parcels, you first have to amalgamate all of them, and then you can re-subdivide them. You'll also carry forward all estate boundary lines. I'll give a better example of that in a picture just now. Okay, so this is interesting because field surveys are basically the same, but there's some things that are very similar and some things that are very different. Rural farm surveys will have a lot of stone cairns, if it's the really old ones. We have several surveys that are from the 1700s and 1800s that'll have stone cairns, and you find many of them in a usable condition. We have lots of survey marks that you'll see in this top picture here that are similar to what New Zealand has. They look exactly the same on the inside. Our trig beacons, again, are very similar to New Zealand's, but slightly different. There's the vane on top that you can actually just pull out of the top if you need to set up on the vane. If you're sighting it from a far distance, you just sight up the vane or up the center of the pillar in case the vane is slightly skewed. And the most interesting thing to me were the boundary pegs. These are South African boundary pegs. It's just iron rebar. In an urban space, you'll use 12mm round iron pegs, and in rural farm surveys, you'll use 16mm round iron pegs. You get taught very quickly at university not to abbreviate round iron peg to RIP. If you can't put a peg into the ground, you can drill a hole. So, for example, if your boundary point falls on top of solid granite, or you're in the middle of the Karoo and the ground is really, really hard, you may find you can't actually get these pegs into the ground. So you can put in a drill hole. You can also use a fence post. Fence posts are very commonly used on farm surveys, just because of the accuracy tolerances. Using a fence post this big is within tolerance. And a very common use of beacons within cities is wall corners. Like I said before, we have very little ground movement, so using a wall corner is very commonplace. We don't use boundary discs. I've seen those for the first time here. We do have a couple of them for some of our geodetic control. Keep in mind, though, I surveyed in the Western Cape, so there may be other land surveyors from the Gauteng or other provinces in South Africa who may have experienced different types of survey marks, but these are the survey marks that are listed in the survey regulations. I have spoken to you about the coordinates, and what is very interesting to me is the one-man teams. In South Africa, you will almost never survey as a one-man team. It's just not a good safety practice, and you may lose your total station if you try to do a robotic survey by yourself. The survey rules and regulations are quite interesting because South Africa's haven't been updated or haven't been rewritten since 1997. They're based on the Land Survey Act that is currently in use, which is from 1997 as well. And they're much shorter than the New Zealand regulations. They are about a third the size. However, they're much more restrictive. So, and I think that's what makes them shorter, because the majority of the time it's saying you can't do this, you have to do this. Whereas in New Zealand, there's scenarios that get given for what you may or may not want to do. Occupation diagrams is another thing that South Africa doesn't use. So you might find that South African survey colleagues aren't familiar with them at first because they haven't had to draw them. And yeah, I've never come across them in South Africa. Another interesting one for me is actually a big topic at the moment in the survey rules, the draft rules for 2020 here, is the ambulatory centerline water boundaries. In South Africa, one of the most common types of water boundaries used is a centerline water boundary, and it's always ambulatory unless stated otherwise. So you'll normally get your diagram saying, for example, the figure A, B, C, middle of river, C, D, and it'll continue like that, and I'll draw the middle of the river. And the survey of the middle of the river will appear in the survey record, which is similar to your CSD. And it's just a given that that boundary is constantly moving between the two owners. So you know that if you buy a property that's on a river boundary, you know it moves with the river. It is, however, subject to accretion and erosion and avulsion and things like that. So if there is artificial diversion of the river, it will remain fixed in its previous position. But that's a whole another thing. But that was an interesting one to me, that South Africa frequently uses middle of river as a boundary description. And oh yes, classes of survey has been another interesting one for me. South Africa would only have one class of survey in any given survey. You wouldn't be mixing classes for different boundaries. So that's another thing that makes the New Zealand system more flexible. Oh, sorry, I'm just going to have a sip of water. Yes, old marks. If you'd like to use an old mark in your on a primary parcel that you're busy surveying, or even a non-primary parcel, if one of those boundary points is an old mark, you can't just adopt it. I did touch on this before. You cannot just adopt that mark from a previous survey. Even if you surveyed one of their points, you have to physically survey that mark and confirm its position in relation to your boundary definition, and make sure that your boundary definition lines up with that old mark and where it physically exists in the ground. Every survey has to be connected to the National Control Survey System via coordinates. That's quite a crucial one there. I'll show you on the diagrams. You'll see all of the South African diagrams will have coordinates, and then they'll have town survey marks or trig marks and the coordinates listed there to show how they're connected to the National Control Survey System. I won't speak too much on title deed registration because I'm not a conveyancer or solicitor. I have worked a little bit with the deeds office in Cape Town, and working in the Surveyor-General's office, I did deal with the deeds office. What I can tell you is that it is definitely different to the New Zealand system. They still use the deeds registration system that New Zealand used to use way back. It's also based on very old legislation. The system hasn't changed very much over the years. And when you transfer land, you create a completely new deed of transfer. Sorry, I don't have any newer examples of deeds of transfer. I really did look for one. But for some reason, I was only finding the older ones. Don't worry, South Africa doesn't pay for transfers with stamps anymore. Yeah, so there was something else, sorry. I can't remember. But yeah, so that's the South African system and how that works at the moment. Yes, so what is interesting is seeing the difference between the New Zealand system and the South African system, in that in the Torrens system, on that title, you see all the encumbrances on a property, whereas in the South African system, you don't. So on a deed, you will see the description, the owners, the old owners, the new owners, how much they paid for the property. But then you could see conditions that say things like conditions from previous deed, and they'll list the deed number, still apply. And that deed number, if you go back, could say this exact same thing and list a previous deed. So you end up with a system where you're trying to find out all of the encumbrances on a property, and you've got to go through deed after deed after deed to get that information. And that's what makes the Torrent system so effective, because you don't have to do that. Okay, so now I'm going to just go into some examples of plans and the type of survey software and things like that that the examiners are using and the Surveyor-General's office is using in South Africa. What is very interesting, if you look between these two, so this is just the general processing of plans and that sort of thing in Landonline, and this one is the spatial. So what is quite interesting about this is if you look at the age of the technology, it's basically the same as New Zealand's. The capabilities of it in general is the same as New Zealand. I think the big difference is that in terms of spatial and that kind of information is that New Zealand's system has the Surveyor-General's database and the titles database or the Registrar-General's database together in Landonline and accessible in one area, whereas and it's available to the public if you pay for access to Landonline. But in South Africa, that's not really the case. It's slightly different. The Deeds Office database is completely separate to the Surveyor-General, and the Surveyor-General's database is not available to the public in the same application or same window. If a surveyor does want the special information from the Surveyor-General's office, they can get it free of charge. They can go to the Surveyor-General's office with a hard drive and copy the whole lot. There are also companies that do that as well, but then they will constantly update that information and create a platform that they sell to surveyors so that the surveyors can constantly access that information. However, that being said, while those databases exist, this spatial information has exactly the same, you could almost say, sort of value as Landonline's spatial information, in that as a surveyor, you can't rely on Landonline's spatial information. You need to rely on the diagrams and the plans and the source of that information. You can't just copy the spatial lines from Landonline or map guides straight across. Okay, so now it gets a little bit interesting. I'm going to show you some of the plans that surveyors would be using in South Africa to maybe give a bit of perspective of what your employees or colleagues are talking about some of the time if they are South Africans. Noting sheets might seem quite familiar to some of the surveyors here as well. I think New Zealand used to use a form of this. These are huge sheets that are kept in the Surveyor-General's office and manually amended every time a survey comes in. This would be your first port of call if I got asked to subdivide one of these parcels. I would come in, I would look for these black dots, which are very useful because that tells you that those boundary points are on the national grid or on the national coordinate system. So it means it's most likely going to be a bit easier for me to use those points to help build my boundary definition. So, for example, you can see this block up to the left. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but the block up in the northwestern corner here doesn't have that many dots. So you might struggle a bit. You'd have to find these black dots and then start building your definition off of there and go from the larger block inwards in building that definition. Whereas some of the other blocks you can see have all been resurveyed. These noting sheets will also tell you the survey records that placed those points, which can be very useful as well. You'll then go from here to the plan that defines, or the diagram that actually defined that earth in the first place. These are two examples of very basic subdivisional diagrams. On the left, there's the urban subdivision. On the right, there's a very small farm subdivision. Sorry. So you can see it's quite different to the New Zealand one in that there's a data table here that has all the coordinates of all the points. It also has the town survey marks that the survey is based on. It also has the vectors between those points, so the sides and the bearings for each side that are also important as well. The point names will always be A, B, C, D in a clockwise direction from the top left. And you'll see the beacon descriptions are separate. That was an interesting thing for me when I got here, is that New Zealand has effectively their mark descriptions are in the name of the mark. And at first I didn't know what IS or IT, and you have to learn what all of those things are. So you may find your South African colleagues don't know what those are and just need to be told what they are. And yeah, you'll have your figure description, your square meterage, your parcel. This will be like your appellation down here, so your earth number, and the situation is in Cape Town. So that kind of information. And what is also quite nice is at the bottom, in the middle block there, you'll see the original diagram. And so that's the parent of this parcel. And it also tells you the first title deed that registers this diagram. So the very first time this diagram gets registered, that title deed number is then put onto the plan. I do also apologize. I might start mixing between the language quite a bit now as I'm looking at these plans. I hope it's all still making sense. Yeah, I think that's most of the stuff on these two plans. If there's any other questions or things you have that you still want to ask about these, just pop them into Slido. These stamps on the side are all the territorial authority consents, or in South Africa would be your municipal consents, and any exemptions that you would have from certain legislation. Or, for example, in this case, this diagram looks like it's going to have to immediately get registered with another diagram. They're probably going to get amalgamated together. And you'll see there's a simultaneous registration stamp on here to force them to be registered at the same time. So there's a lot of that kind of organizing of stamps to make sure they're working correctly. So these only had one parcel on them. You can obviously also have plans that can have hundreds of parcels on them. It'll have exactly the same information on them in terms of coordinates, sides, bearings, and that kind of information. What is interesting is this general plan doesn't get registered as one plan. The properties on them, once this is approved by the Surveyor-General, the properties on this plan will then get separately registered by themselves in their own title deeds. This is, I spoke about this a little bit earlier, a compiled consolidation diagram. So this is an amalgamation of 5 parcels here. You can see them listed at the top. And it's similar to, I suppose, the parcels without survey concept. That's why I've put that in brackets there. And basically, you can do this when all of your parcels have already been surveyed and coordinated onto the national reference system. If they have, then you can create a diagram like this, where it just updates the spatial representation and assigns a new parcel number to it. And then this plan will get registered. What's important to note is that if I had these 5 parcels and I wanted to re-subdivide them into a different layout, I would not be able to do that without creating this diagram first and then subdividing this parcel. You can't just change the layout of a subdivision in one plan without first consolidating all of them together. This is a surveyed consolidation diagram. This is what happens when all of those points I spoke about are not already surveyed on the national reference system. Even if one of your components or one of your parcels is not already surveyed on the national reference system, then you have to survey the whole lot. So, for example, you'll see one of these components, or there are a couple old ones here. There's one from 1808, 1854, 1863. You'll probably find the 1984 and the 1980 plans were on the system, but they all have to be resurveyed now because the other ones weren't. So a new plan will get created with new beacon descriptions, the coordinates after he's surveyed all the marks in the field, the town survey marks he's connected to, all of his vectors are here as well. And what's also interesting is your easements are also shown on this plan. They get described by figures as well, so that you can just follow on the figure in the letters to figure out which are which. You will also bring forward any easements that existed on these parcels before the consolidation, if they're not getting destroyed, they'll all get brought forward onto this plan. And then as they get cancelled through time afterwards and removed from title deeds, the Surveyor-General's office gets notified, and then they'll get removed from these plans. That's why you can see there are a couple of these that have lines through them and then signatures next to them. I think that basically covers what's going on here. I know they look very different to the New Zealand plans. Yes. Okay, so these are easement diagrams, and the reason I brought these to show to you as well, first of all, easements are called servitudes in South Africa, so you might hear a couple of South African surveyors interchanging those names. But you can see on these plans that the land surveyors had to survey every single one of these points. So it's treated similar to a subdivision, even though the easement is on top of a primary parcel. So it's still a primary parcel and a non-primary parcel with different terminology, but you still have to survey it under the same rules as if it were a subdivision. So all of these have, you can see they've got beacon descriptions, they've all been surveyed, they all have coordinates, they all have to be based on the national reference system, and the sides and the bearings are on all the plans. This is a servitude area, and this is a right-of-way servitude, which is the same thing as a right-of-way easement. Okay, first of all, I do apologize that this survey report is in Afrikaans. I only realized that afterwards, but it might be valuable to add to that as well, that in South Africa you can submit surveys in English or Afrikaans, and I think at the moment, I don't know how far the progress on it has come, that they've been looking at Xhosa and Zulu and other languages as well. That are all some of the official language, the 11 official languages of South Africa. At the moment, though, they're predominantly submitted in English and Afrikaans. What is interesting, though, so you have a survey record, which is similar to a CSD, and that survey record is made up of the survey report and then a couple of other things I'm going to show you now, being a coordinate list, your field book, a comparison plan, and a working plan, which I'll show you as well, which are all basically what's included in a CSD. What is interesting is that in a survey report like this, even though she has got a structure in it, there is no required structure according to the survey rules, but most people follow a general structure and that there's a purpose to the survey. She then has her control, how she set up her survey, and then she speaks about her marks and her boundary definition reconstruction. So how she placed those marks, how she set up the definition, how she confirmed it, and then there'll be other general comments added as well at the end. You do have a couple of surveyors who only put in about 3 lines in their survey report. If it is a perfectly basic subdivision that had no issues, that's based on a previous plan that is on the national reference system, it becomes a bit easier because you have to survey all the points every single time. It means often the survey reports become a little less convoluted. So again, this is the same survey, so it's in Afrikaans, my apologies, but this is a coordinate list. It just gives her control points, her witness marks, which are called survey stations in South Africa, and marks that she adopted from neighboring properties. So you can adopt marks that you verified that are from a neighboring survey that you used to confirm your definition, but you didn't necessarily have to survey those points. But you would have had to survey things like witness marks that confirm those points. So she's got some adopted points. She's got all the points she found. And by found, she would have physically have surveyed them. And then she's got the marks that she placed in the ground in this survey. Then these 2 plans, they're also, the survey rules in South Africa have changed quite a bit, where there used to be very strict requirements of how these plans were shown. There were certain colors and circles, and a single circle and a double circle and a colored in circle and all those sorts of things. That's changed quite a bit in that you still have to submit a comparison plan and a working plan, but you don't have to do it in a certain format. So they differ slightly between land surveys, but they have to have certain information in them. So the comparison plan is effectively comparing the vectors between the coordinates. So those distances and the bearings that were on the plans, that's what they're busy comparing here. And what is interesting is in New Zealand, you would adopt the parent or your source plan's vector. So you confirm that vector and you adopt it. Here you can choose which one you'd like to adopt. By doing this plan, what she's doing is showing that the information in brackets is from the parent plan, and the information that isn't is what she surveyed, and then she underlines what she's choosing to adopt. You just have to be consistent in what you're choosing to adopt, because it is based on marks in the ground. So if she feels that her survey is more accurate than the previous surveys, that's her professional discretion. So a lot of land surveys, it'll change a bit between those things. As long as those lines are within allowable tolerances, then it's fine. The only thing we won't allow in South Africa, you can't go and pre-calculate everything on coordinates, then go out, survey everything, be slightly off on everything, and then come back and adopt all of your coordinates that you did in your pre-calc. Then you should be adopting the points and the calculation of the points that you found in the ground, not the calculation, the physical found surveyed coordinate in the ground. So that's fine there. I hope I explained that well enough. This is the working plan. Some of them are in colour, some are not. They used to actually be very similar to New Zealand's survey plans, where you would show your measured vectors on it as well and your adopted vectors, but they've done away with that because we don't really work with the vectors. We work with the coordinates of the points, even though essentially by working with coordinates, you're working with the vectors as well, because a vector is the difference between two coordinates. So on this plan, what you'll be looking at on a working plan is you should be immediately able to look at a plan and see which points she placed, which points she replaced, and then which points she found as well. So these single circles will be showing points that she would have surveyed or placed for the first time now or replaced, and the double circles will be either points she surveyed and found, older marks that she found and verified, and then there are a couple here that will sometimes be in a slightly different color, and they may show points that she has adopted in her reconstruction or her boundary definition, but she didn't actually survey them, but she would have surveyed other points from the same survey. However, she can't do that for the points or boundary points on this parcel that's under survey. Yeah, that was a lot of information. I hope I didn't go through it too quickly, and I hope it made sense. Yeah, shall we see if Jenny is with us and she can let me know if there are any questions that anyone has. Yeah, thank you.
Right, hi Genevieve, sorry. I've just checked, we don't have any questions at all that have come through on Slido. So I think you clearly covered quite a lot of stuff, and any questions that people may have had as you went through the PowerPoint presentation. So I think what we'll do is end the broadcast, and I just want to thank you very much, Genevieve, for your time today, and also thank you to our members who logged in to listen to Genevieve this morning. So I hope you all have a lovely weekend, and please all stay safe out there.